Hey everyone, we are going to do chapter 11, mental disorders. This is likely what you think of when you think of psychology and mental health disorders in psychology. So we'll be covering a number of them. You can go ahead and take the title card down now. All right, let's move on to our first slide, which is dilemmas of diagnosis. So an issue with diagnosing mental health disorders versus physical health disorders, there's a lot of issues because mental disorders can be defined in a lot of different ways. A lot of it depends on cultural standards. Different cultures may be more accepting of certain mental health issues, by not be accepting of certain mental health issues, emotional distress, self-destructive behavior. All these things can combine to a mental health disorder. And how we kind of know what is a mental disorder, what's not, is using the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. This can help define what they are, but it can also lead to overdiagnosis, right? Because just like if you have a cold and you Google your symptoms on, WebMD will pop up and it might say you have something much worse than you have, so that can lead to overdiagnosis. Oh, I'm dying. I have this rare disorder. I have this rare tropical disease. Same thing I have with mental health disorders. I feel sad today. Oh, I probably have major depression. That might not be the case, right? So, and it may not necessarily be objective. It could really be hitting on, certain things, traits, cultures, countries that are different. And oftentimes labels can be hurtful, right? It's a stigma that we're trying to get rid of, especially in the United States, but around the world, that having anxiety, having depression, having schizophrenia, having bipolar disorder does not mean that you're insane, does not mean that you're crazy, does not mean that you can't be an extremely productive member of society and be a leader and, be great at what you do, and so, but saying that, can have a stigma. You tell people that you have schizophrenia, that can have a stigma attached to it. So hopefully it's something we can get rid of, and hopefully this is a course that can help that. And sometimes it can be confused with normal problems, right? We have normal emotions and feelings as humans. That goes with overdiagnosis, that can be an issue. So that's Dylan's diagnosis. Go ahead and copy this down if you haven't. Move on to the next slide. So what are the issues with, how do we figure out, how do we diagnose, and how do we kind of measure these things is another issue, right? When we're talking about like medical conditions physically, you can get a blood tests and there's certain tests that we can do. So we want to have those in psychology too, but it can be a lot tougher to kind of diagnose and define how do we measure these things. So, some of the measurement are projective tests, which are kind of more ambiguous things, pictures, sentences, using Gestalt principles, different things like that. So some of the like psychodynamic things might ask you, finish the sentence. My father is blank. Women are blank. And so can show maybe your thoughts and feelings on those things. Or probably the most famous, the Rorschach ink blot tests, right? What do you see in this ink blot test? Might be something we explore later in this unit. I'll show you some ink blots and we can talk about them. But is that a good diagnosis? Does it really measure a mental disorder? Not quite. How about with children? A lot of times it's how they play, how they draw things. There's a big push a long time ago that if you gave children the choice of dolls, some dolls had genitalia and some dolls didn't. That they played with the dolls that had penises or the dolls that had breasts and vaginas, that meant that they went through some type of sexual trauma. And that wasn't true. It simply wasn't true. It wasn't objective. And so that's the problem with projective tests. It can lead to misdiagnosis, can lead to assumptions that lead to misdiagnosis, can be a big problem. So we try to come up with objective tests, right? So like in school, you take the Keystone exams. That's an objective test. Everyone's taking the same test. We're testing a certain thing. And so we try to come up with that for psychology, the most popular being the MMPI, the Minnesota Multifaceted Personality Inventory, that kind of asks a ton of questions that can lead to diagnosis of things, such as everything from depression to schizophrenia to just being an introvert. It can measure a lot of these different things. I know as a teacher, I've filled out the MMPI for students when being diagnosed. You fill this out, and it asks you about, does the student have a problem with vandalizing properties? Does the student have a problem with being violent towards others? Things like that. Do they, talk about their family life in certain ways, things like that. So it seems like, okay, this is an objective test. This is good, and it can be good, but it can lead to false positives. When you ask you remember we talked about like leading questions in memory. It can be very similar for this. When they ask me a question, does the student have violent tendencies towards others? I might remember a time. There's a time they kind of hit their friend jokingly. Is that a violent tendency? I don't know. I'll rate it or I'll put yes. So that can lead to some false positives. It also doesn't account for some cultural differences. There could be different actions taken based on culture that, I might see as someone that grew up here in Pittsburgh and, the white suburbs of Pittsburgh as being introversion or being, more quote unquote violent, but it's not. And that can be an issue too. So all these have problems, and that's why diagnosis sometimes is the first step and is an issue. Let's go and take this down if you haven't. Let's move on to slide 3, anxiety disorders. So let's get into some disorders and talk about them. And one of the most one disorder that's really on the rise is anxiety disorders, is generalized anxiety disorder, right? This for foreboding and dread that occurs for a majority of days in a 6-month period, right? If over a 6-month period you're feeling anxious for most days, then that's usually how generalized anxiety disorder is diagnosed. And so, it can really range in terms of things. This has to be not brought on by physical causes, so drugs, drinking, too much coffee, things like that. It can range from restlessness, feeling kind of jittery, having intense worrying, having disturbed sleep, all the way to having panic attacks, right? Which we'll get into with panic disorder is generally, if that happens often, that'd be panic disorder. So that's generalized anxiety disorder. And a piece of this is PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. This happens due to a combination of traumatic events and the neurological component. So something we'll dig more into. But this is kind of found with soldiers going to war. They had traumatic events and had a neurological component that they were susceptible to this, then PTSD can happen. Just because you are a soldier and just because you see traumatic events doesn't mean PTSD will happen, or just because you have the neurological component doesn't mean it will happen. So we'll get into that later. And then panic disorder, which is usually panic attacks, trembling, shaking, chest pain, that hard breathing, rapid breathing, sweating, having a physical reaction to anxiety is a panic attack, and they can occur kind of out of nowhere after certain triggers, frightening experiences, things like that. And sometimes this can be tough, because you might not know what that is until it happens. This happens throughout the world. There are definitely cultural influences on certain symptoms and how symptoms happen. So, in Latin America and Southern Europe, panic attacks usually involve feeling like you're being choked or smothered, or fear of dying. Northern Europe and the U.S. usually it's public places that happen with panic disorders. It's kind of interesting, how this happens, right? Like in Greenland, For example, where it's a lot of fisherman culture, kind of rugged culture. Panic attacks usually more with dizziness and fear that occurs while someone's fishing and in a one-person kayak. It's called kayaking. So, like different cultures, the panic disorders look different, and that's something that has to be thought about. All right, let's move on to phobias and OCD. So people can develop phobias through either conditioning or personality. So either that they get really scared when they see a spider or have a bad experience with a spider, they'll feel that same feeling. That's a phobia that's developed through conditioning, or it could be through personality, evolutionary. We've talked about, you see a big snake, you're afraid of the snake. That's evolutionary because that snake could kill you. That can develop into a phobia. Probably the worst phobia is agoraphobia, is fear of, public places, fear of just being in public or with other people. This can be super extreme, and it can be tied to a panic disorder. That agoraphobia, you might just have a fear of interaction with people, and it's something in our society, in our world, that simply you have to interact with people, and so how do you kind of overcome that? Can be really hard. It can usually start with panic attacks, but can be kind of unexpected, and people start avoiding all situations, right? What happens if you have this while you're driving your car? You have a panic attack because of agoraphobia. It can lead to a lot of problems. So we'll get into that a little bit more as well. But there's different phobias. I used a couple examples here. Mysophobia, fear of germs, other social phobias, being observed by others, so we'll get into phobias a little bit more as well. Obsessive compulsive disorder is, OCD combines obsessive, frightening thoughts with compulsions that have to happen to avoid those fears happening. And OCD is one of those that I think sometimes people have played off as trivial. Oh, I have a little bit of OCD or whatever, and it's usually not the case, right? That you have to combine obsessive with compulsive. So it's not a unified disorder. It can range in a lot of different ways, but there has to be, a obsessive thought. It can be something that's, not very extreme to, if I don't do this, I'm going to have a panic attack, to something that is extreme. I feel like I might, kill my parents, can be an obsessive thought. So I have to do something to not have that happen. This some forms of OCD can be, I'm scared of someone breaking in and killing me or robbing my house, right? That's an obsessive thought. How do I fix that? I have to make sure every door is locked. So how many times do you have to check that to make sure it's absolutely true? Might be once, might be 5 times, might be 20 times. And there might be a ritual associated with checking those locks. If you break that ritual, you have to start over again. That'd be OCD. Sometimes it can do with cleanliness, with that mysophobia. If you have that fear of germs, that can develop into OCD, right? That if I don't wash my hands enough, I'm going to get this disease and get really sick or die. And so I have to wash my hands. How many times do you have to wash your hands? Well, once might not be enough, or maybe for 30 seconds isn't enough. Maybe it has to be for 5 minutes or 10 minutes or 30 minutes. What happens if you wash your hands till your hands are raw? That could be a problem. So it definitely ranges in terms of examples. Like hoarding is a type of OCD. We try to have to keep things because if I don't, I'm going to lose everything. Something that happened. To these kind of compulsive rituals. So something else we'll dig into as time goes on. Let's talk about mood disorders briefly. So mood disorders range from, major depression, and that's characterized by despair, often thinking of death and suicide. So there could have to be physical changes. With depression, how do you kind of deal with that depression? It can be a problem. It could be insomnia. You can't sleep. It could be you're sleeping too much. It could be overeating. It could be undereating. How you deal with those things. And everyone goes through, bouts of depression. And major depression is when it kind of takes over, right, for long periods of time. Often things that you enjoyed before you don't enjoy anymore, and nothing is enjoyable, right? And so how do you fill that void? That can be what happens. And so bipolar disorder is kind of the extremes of that. Very, very deep depression, not enjoying anything, not being able to get out of bed. It can be something like overeating to try to get rid of that, with bouts of extreme mania of, just kind of going off the handle, risky behavior, whether it be things like sex or shopping or gambling, is often associated with bipolar disorder. Making impulsive or bad decisions, in those extreme bouts of mania, and then you fall back to the depression. So very extremes in bipolar disorder, thus the bipolar, the two extremes, two poles with that. And so there's a lot of theories on depression, and we'll get into bipolar disorder more later as well. But there's a lot of theories on depression and how to diagnose what triggers this. So the vulnerability stress model shows that a triggering event with a predisposition, can trigger major depression, and that can happen. It doesn't necessarily need that, but it can happen. So let's get into the next slide of factors of depression, some of the different factors that exist. So we have genetic factors. If you have lower levels of serotonin, higher levels of cortisol, can contribute to depression. And psychologists have even identified a single gene that comes in two forms. It can be kind of a long form of that gene that helps protect people from depression, or a shorter form of that gene that makes people more vulnerable to it. So there's been a lot of studies done that there's a genetic component to depression. And when we talk about neurotransmitters and things like that, that can lead to it. Life experiences and circumstances, if you're exposed to violence and abuse early, that can trigger depression for sure. So the condition of people's lives can affect their likelihood, right? If you kind of have a stable lifestyle, you're married, you have a job, you're less likely to experience depression. Not saying that you won't, but less likely to experience it. Loss of relationships can happen. Many depressed people, that go through separations, divorces, losing a child, things like that, right? That can definitely trigger that. And then just cognitive habits, believing that your situation is permanent or uncontrollable can lead to depression, feeling like you can't get out of a rut, there's no way you're ever going to be able to change things. One of the strongest habits is rumination, that you're just kind of brooding about everything that's wrong, focusing on what's wrong instead of what's right, facing it alone. That can happen as well. So let's talk about personality disorders. So personality disorders can be things ranging from paranoid personality disorder to not trusting anyone, being paranoid that everyone's out to get you, from your close relatives to the government, that even with evidence against it, you believe, what you think is true, to narcissism, narcissistic personality disorder, having this high level of self-importance, that, you are kind of the most important thing. Everyone probably knows a narcissist or two, and that's, the problem. When does it become narcissistic personality disorder versus having, just kind of this high self-importance of yourself? That's a problem with it, because I think narcissism can be so extreme that you stop caring about others, and that's when it becomes an issue, right? When all that matters is what happens to you. That's narcissistic personality disorder. They can go to another step of psychopathy, or as we kind of the term that we probably know as psychopaths, right? That's what that term comes from, is the inability to feel emotion, that you don't feel emotion towards anyone. You don't feel extremes of emotion. And psychopaths can be, very charming, but underneath can't really connect to others, right? Having that I always say it wrong, right? Psychopathy, psychopaths having that. So that's when many people that were serial killers or were extremely violent serial rapists. Not always, but some of them have this inability to feel emotion, that what they're doing is wrong, or that they care about what other people are feeling like. And so that's something that you need to get help with. That mental health and help can be helpful. And then antisocial personality disorder, APD, is a disregard for others, often leading to crime. So this can often develop into some of those other things. This is a big pattern, repeatedly breaking the law, very impulsive, trying to get kind of quick thrills, right? Like, robbing a convenience store just for fun, not that you need the money, you just want to do it. That can be APD. There's kind of a disregard for your own safety. Doesn't matter if you miss work. Doesn't matter if you miss school. Doesn't matter if you commit a crime. It's not gonna, it's not gonna hurt you. Go for kind of the thrill of it. So that obviously can be a problem, especially because it happens very young often. Let me go to the next slide here. What are some causes of APD which can lead to psychopathy? I still can't say it, to someone becoming a psychopath or anything of that nature. So we see often there is a lot of these are biological functions. Abnormalities in the central nervous system often can lead to APD. So the inability of psychopaths and people with APD to feel emotional arousal, that empathy or guilt or fear of punishment or anxiety under stress, suggests that their central nervous system just doesn't have them feel those things. They don't, anticipate danger or pain or punishment like normal people do. Also, an impairment in their frontal lobe of their brain, the functioning of that something we see psychopaths and people with APD is just their impulsiveness. They have no control, self-control over saying, hey, maybe I shouldn't, bring a gun to the store and hold it up and rob it. That can be an abnormality in their frontal cortex and how they think about those things. So they actually did a PET scan study of serial killers, that they had less brain activity in their frontal lobe than men that murdered people. And they found their wife cheating on them and immediately murdered out of passion. There's a difference there. And then genetic influences, right? Is there genetic influences in this? And they found that genes accounted for APD in about half the cases that they found. Oftentimes physically abused as children, sexually abused as children, saw genetic development happen differently. So that can lead to it too. Then drug abuse and addiction. Addiction itself, right, is a mental disorder, and drugs and alcohol can affect the brain to cause addiction, right? So drugs have addictive qualities. Alcohol has addictive qualities. So it can actually affect and change your brain physiology to cause addiction. But there's also a genetic link. And the strength of the genetic link is still to be determined. But, if there is, a lot of researchers thought they had found kind of a quote-unquote alcoholism gene that affected brain receptors, but it hasn't been, super supported. So, there could be basically, but you can have genes that protect you against alcoholism, that can protect you against an addictive personality. And if you don't have that, then you could be prone to alcoholism. And it's usually genetic. So meaning, your parents are, a parent is an alcoholic, a parent is a drug abuser, that you're probably not genetically protected against that, and something you should be weary of and watch out for. Interestingly, total abstinence tends to lead to increased rates of addiction than reduce them. So going you're an alcoholic, you just stop drinking alcohol at all, usually has falling more rates of addiction than, moving down and trying to do things in moderation. So basically, what they found is like people that said, "I'm never going to drink in my life," um, usually will become alcoholics more than those that socially drink, once a week. It can happen. It depends, but it can be an issue. And the reasons for doing something can lead to addiction, as well as the biological changes to it. Addictions can result from the abuse of drugs, right? Drugs change the brain, things like that. So, the reason for doing it, are you doing drugs because it's social? Are you doing drugs because you're depressed? Why are you drinking? You drinking because of depression? Are you drinking because of hanging out with people? Or are you kind of pressured to drink more? All those things can lead to whether you become addicted or not. We'll talk more about addiction later in the as well, for sure. We'll get more into it. Dissociative identity disorder, still popularly called multiple personality disorder. Very, very rare. A lot of people that are diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder don't actually have it. Now, this is the idea that people have multiple personalities. You can kind of switch to and from multiple personalities, that you don't remember what happens in the other personality. Might be kind of sociocognitive, for people that are just unable to truly present themselves, that they kind of put this front up, that it's not real, but that they feel more comfortable saying, "Oh, I'm a different person, so I can act differently," right? Which makes sense, but that's not truly dissociative identity disorder. So we'll talk about it more as we move on. But how that's seen in film and TV and things usually isn't true. There doesn't seem to be a true genetic influence or impact, which lead to, some people believe this maybe doesn't even exist, that it could be a combination of other mental disorders. And so there's still a lot unknown about it. I'll talk about schizophrenia, because, I think schizophrenia is probably the one that is most, most is kind of, honestly, that people think they know about, but don't actually know about it, right? So schizophrenia is not multiple personality disorder. A lot of people think schizophrenia, you have a split personality or multiple personalities. That's not true. Schizophrenia is a type of psychosis. This is distorted perception of reality, right? So what you perceive as true isn't true. It's the cancer of mental illness, right? It's kind of very complex. It's elusive. There's different forms. Some are, very extreme, and some are not. So there's a lot involved with it. Symptoms usually include bizarre illusions. So it can go to the extreme that dogs are aliens disguised as pets. To people believing that they're Jesus. Those are kind of the extremes, right? Some can be more paranoid delusions that, someone coughing or seeing a plane above head is like a plot against you. That can be kind of an extreme case with that. So that could be an issue. So like even hallucinations, just seeing things that aren't real, is usually most people with schizophrenia have this, and often people with schizophrenia, try to commit suicide to escape from these hallucinations. You might hear voices telling you to do things. That's a big piece of schizophrenia. And you have to, learn to either deal with that or, usually medication can help. Disorganized thinking, speech, sometimes what's called like a word salad. They're just throwing words together. There might be some incoherence that happens oftentimes. Inappropriate behavior can range from, acting like a child to being violent to, wearing weird clothing, to hoarding, a lot of different things that can occur, but usually some kind of hallmark with schizophrenia that something's off, right, with that. And then impaired cognitive ability is that, people with schizophrenia do much worse than healthy people in everyday cognitive areas, verbal learning, recalling words, memory, attention, problem solving, um, things like that. And so, once again, schizophrenia is something that can be addressed. It's something that can be not necessarily cured, but treated, and you can live, a normal life with schizophrenia. But treatment does need to happen, and that's kind of the key. So where does this come from, right? What are the origins of schizophrenia? There's definitely a genetic predisposition that if, what we found with identical twin studies, if an identical twin has schizophrenia, their twin is much more likely to develop it. Children with a schizophrenic parent, have a lifetime risk of about 12%. Children with two schizophrenic parents moves up to, 40 to 50%, compared to the general population of 1 to 2%. So there's definitely a genetic element to it. Once again, if you have a parent, you have a sibling with schizophrenia, something to be aware of, and probably to, start to take preventative measures. Brain abnormalities. Most individuals with schizophrenia have some type of brain abnormality. They're different, depends. I won't get into the specifics, but that occurs. Neurotransmitter abnormalities, certain neurotransmitters like dopamine, serotonin, etc. Some issues with that. Prenatal problems, birth complications, so damage to fetal brain development when you're a fetus and developing, that can increase your likelihood for schizophrenia, sometimes 2 or 3 times as likely. And then, adolescent abnormalities and brain development. So that's, if in adolescence, as your brain's developing, if you have problems, it could be violence, things like that, early drinking, at a very, very young age can occur with that as well. So we will dig more into all these things, and what do they really look like? What's treatment really look like? And we'll get into it. But thank you so much, and I hope everyone has a great day. I'll talk to you soon.